Okay, I guess we will slowly start. We are super happy to have you all and welcome you to the second of our YSI RSA webinar series on regional inequalities and perceived left-behindness. And we really looking forward to a nice talk of Greta. But before we start, we invite you to, during the talk, put all your questions and ask all your questions in the chat and mark them with a capital Q, and invite you then to raise your hand after the talk to join us during the discussion. With this said, we are super happy to have Grete Gansauer, Assistant Professor of Sustainable Communities at the Hauptschule of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming, who's also co-organizer of the RSA EDGE network, a research network on peripheral regions. And now we are looking forward to an inspiring talk on spatial imaginaries of left-behind places in US policy discourse. And with this, Greta, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing the slides and invite you to share yours.
Great. Thanks, Max. Oh, I just requested to share from the host. Okay. There we go. Let me... Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Max and Christian, for organizing. Thanks to the Young Scholars Initiative and the Regional Studies Association for sponsoring this series. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to convene here with you all and talk about regional inequality, something I think about a lot, and obviously it has a whole global community of scholars also thinking about it. So I'd love to have some time for a discussion after my talk today. First, can I just check, am I sharing? I have two monitors. Am I sharing the, okay, we're good, great, thanks. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper which I'm working on with Max. So excited to share this with you all. This paper is unpacking the spatial imaginary of how the left behind place spatial imaginary is constructed with a focus on US policy discourse and policy expert perspectives. So for the talk today, first I'll describe kind of the Left Behind Places debate and how Left Behind Places is emerging as a spatial imaginary over especially the last 10 years or so. And I'm going to focus on this one study, which comes out of my dissertation research, is kind of a reevaluate or reanalysis of interviews I conducted. And I'll describe my findings, which is that there are really two spatial imaginaries, two different narrative frames within the Left Behind Places spatial imaginary. One which constructs left behind places around their assets or their latent economic potential, and one which frames them around their deficits, which I call foreclosed potential places. Then I'll discuss some of the implications of these findings for policy and broader regional inequality debates. Okay, so the Left Behind Places as a spatial imaginary. So as we know, I think we're all here because spatial inequalities and regional inequalities are on the rise, especially in the global north. This came to fore in academic and political thought and inspired urgent action, research action and attention, especially since 2016 with the Brexit vote and Donald Trump's election in my country, in the US, and just general rise of authoritarian populist politics, which had a very distinct geography, which I can't believe that those elections were almost 10 years ago now, but we still have really strong spatial differentiation in voting patterns correlated with spatial differentiation in economic opportunity and socio-economic inequalities. So there's been a lot of research attention to mapping these inequalities, figuring out where they are, categorizing them, typologizing them. But generally, this conversation focuses on the relative disparities in the spatial economy. So it's, yeah, kind of mapping the economic output or socioeconomic indicators of different places within countries or at continental scale. Between places, identifying places that are lagging behind and identifying places which largely have taken the opportunities offered by globalization and structural transitions in the broader economy towards digitalization and financialization, able to spin those into competitive advantages. So this really what I'd like to take away from this overall kind of conversation surrounding regional inequality at the moment is it tends to be very focused on relative disparities. However, there could be more attention paid, and this is starting to be a conversation. There could be more attention paid to the relational factors that go into producing spatial inequality and uneven development. And that's where I try to situate this research, specifically focusing on the social and power relations, which produce left behind space, so to speak. So under that framing, I think it's important to recognize that the term left behind places is actually somewhat new to describe uneven development manifestations in the 21st century. So, of course, we've had uneven development all throughout history, even dating way back, and even in like more recent iterations of capitalism, there have of course been regional inequalities or spatially uneven development. But the term left behind places has really only reemerged in policy discourse since globalization has taken root over the last couple decades, and then really since the global financial crisis in 2008, where some regions were able to recover their economies and spin up and access growth trajectories since 2008, and other regions have not recovered very well. So as this recent paper from Andy Pike and colleagues notes, the left behind places as we describe them today implies places that are not keeping up economically, that they're lagging or underperforming, but also that they've been excluded from these growth opportunities and infrastructure investments by the state and by private capital. So again, this kind of paints this relative positioning, this hierarchical comparison between superstar cities and those left behind by growth opportunities. And this term left behind is relative in itself, right? It's kind of relatively positions them from some sort of standard of not left behind or mainstream keeping up type of places. So even the term, the term left behind is relative, but it also implies kind of global capital's narrative of them. So in in today's iteration of the left behind places debate, these places have been left behind by global capital. So this is to say, this is regional inequalities have existed for a long time. They've obviously been a problem in economic geography and other related disciplines, but studying regional inequalities or persistently impoverished or deprived regions, framing them as left behind is a relatively new phenomenon. So I'm interested in the discourses surrounding left behind places and how social and power relations produce the conception that certain places are left behind, and how this imaginary of the left behind place is constructed. Right, so this led me to start to think about left behind places as a spatial imaginary. This seems to be an emerging theme where within economic geography and and related disciplines, regional studies, transition studies, studying green transitions. There's been some new scholarship on this. Spatial imaginaries are representational discourses. They are the way that social groups imagine, represent, and assign meaning to space and place. And Watkins identifies three types of spatial imaginaries. I would say that left behind places are under Watkins typology and a type of idealized space with negative associations. So idealized spaces are descriptions of generalized kinds or types of places, which are assigned universal characteristics. So the left behind place or the left behind place spatial imaginary is one that has negative associations of decline, blight in the built environment, and lack of economic opportunities, for example, when you call to mind a left behind place. And drawing on kind of Foucault post-structural theory, spatial imaginaries and these discourses construct truths around what types of characteristics are assigned to them. And so I'm interested in what truths are constructed within the left behind place spatial imaginary. So there is recognition within Left Behind Places literature and regional inequality literature that the Left Behind Place is a new spatial imaginary, but there has not yet been any studies, to my knowledge, unpacking exactly the truths and knowledges which are represented in this discourse. So this is the gap that paper fills. With a focus on power holding, kind of a powerful group. So we focus on policy entrepreneurs, policy experts in the US, who are essentially a group of both within government and outside of government, think tank personnel and also within government policy implementers who are the group of people whose ideas show up in policy, are actually formulated into policy. So we're interested in what truths they hold about left behind places and then how that actually shows up in policy. So I was collecting data and interview data for this research during the US Biden administration in Washington, D.C. And at the time, there was a major surge in place-based policy, which was quite unusual for the US. So that research project was interested in how place-based policy was designed to meet the needs of left behind places. And at the time, there was over $100 billion of investment towards place-based or regional policies. So these policies were designed in response to a number of issues, as it has been recognized, but one of them was regional inequalities in the US. So at this time, I started to understand, draw on critical political science to understand regional inequality as a new policy problem in the US. So, policy problems, as defined in poli-sci, are political, or I should say, they are societal problems which rise to the level of becoming political agenda action items. So, there becomes consensus even across greater than ideology. There becomes consensus that there is need for corrective policy action. Ideologies might decide that action could take place in different directions, but regional inequality and left behind places or persistently impoverished or low growth regions became a new policy problem in the US at this time. So I started to, so alongside the spatial imaginary of left behind places, I wanted to deconstruct how policy problems within left behind places were represented, because critical political scientists also argue that policy problems, just like spatial imaginaries, are also representational discourses. They have narratives assigned to them. They're not neutral, problems that just innately exist out there. They are represented and bound up with socially constructed truths, or socially constructed truths, which become our knowledges, which become widely accepted as true, based on power flows and how powerful actors narrate and assign meaning to them. So this study, examines how powerful actors within the US construct truths around the left behind places spatial imaginary, and how they assign policy problems to or within that spatial imaginary and to their construction of left behind places. Okay, so I'll describe my methods next. As I briefly mentioned, this is a reanalysis of data collected for my dissertation. I conducted 31 interviews with policy experts in the US. So my interviewees included think tank personnel, people within government in the executive and legislative branch, so executive agencies, as well as congressional staffers. I did have a couple conversations with elected officials, including one interview and this quick coffee conversation that's pictured here. I was accessing experts in regional policy, place-based policies that were coming up at the time, and folks concerned with regional inequality issues. To this interview set, I applied a "what is the problem represented to be" approach. So this is a method from critical political science and discourse analysis, which identifies kind of seven questions to ask of the data that identify how policy problems are represented. And I did 2 passes of coding. This is also buttressed by a big document analysis effort that I did, and for a separate project, a separate paper. And then at that time, I also was observing events and just generally tracking media narratives surrounding U.S. place-based policy and regional inequality at the time. But the findings I'm going to present today really rely on this analysis of my interviews. Okay. So I identify that the Left Behind Places spatial imaginary is bifurcated into 2 different narrative frames. So I'm going to walk through these, through the themes through the themes in each of these, and provide some supportive quotes. But the first frame is what I call latent potential regions. And here the policy problem, is that they're low growth, underperforming regions relative to other superstar cities. And the narrative is that they have unlocked potential that is kind of latent there in their labor markets, or due to comparative advantages in their property markets. So accessing and transitioning toward a growth trajectory is imagined or narrated to be possible here. If only that latent potential could be unlocked by federal government place-based policies. The second narrative frame in the Left Behind Places spatial imaginary that I identify is called foreclosed potential regions. So in this narrative is framed around Left Behind Places deficits. So in this type of framing, the policy problem is that they are socially and historically disadvantaged. This is a racialized narrative, which is tied to racial histories of disenfranchisement and dispossession in the U.S., which are very real. And these are places which are imagined to have little potential for new path creation, little potential to access a new growth trajectory. And therefore they require place-based policies are delivered to them because they require government assistance on social or moral grounds. And before I move on, I'll make a couple caveats. First is that these frames are definitely specific to the US context, especially concerning racial histories, and kind of the need for government support to correct past histories of government under or disinvestment. Yeah, they're specific to the US frame or the US case, and they're specific to a specific moment in time that I collected this data, which was in the Biden administration, and obviously the politics have changed since then, to say the least. Okay, first I'll walk through latent potential regions, places where growth could be unlocked. So I'll first talk through this side. I'll present a few supportive quotes, and then I'll fill in this table with the foreclosed potential regions on the other side. So the economic geography in the latent potential imaginary is that these are narrated to be low growth regions where a transition to a growth trajectory is possible. I think importantly, they are narrated to have been left behind by globalized markets. This is different for foreclosed potential regions. This creates a relationship to the state where the federal state and policy is imagined to be investment. So investment implies that there's an expected potential for return on your investment. So place-based policies for these regions are investments that could deliver growth returns. And contributions to national growth or the nation's capacity to be competitive. So this positions the state as a venture capitalist and as an investor, and it positions the state to take on risk or that the private sector is unwilling to. So these are places which have low rates of private investment relative to other, more high growth cities or regions. And so the policy problem is for the state to take on some of that risk and incentivize private dollars to flow into these latent potential regions and unlock their growth trajectories. So the policy problems here is that these latent potential regions are not competitive on a global scale, and the US wants them to be. So this requires policy which will intervene and create a modernization of industry, again, de-risking private sector investments, and help these regions transition not only to a growth trajectory in their own right, but ultimately to contribute to broader US national competitiveness. So this is where we see a lot of the US's industrial policy efforts are delivered toward unlocking growth potential in key sectors and emerging regions. So I won't bombard you with quotes. I'll just highlight a couple here that get to some of these themes. So let's start at the bottom. This person says the federal government is in a position to take on riskier investments. These are not automatically going to pay off, like private capital, where private capital would be. The places are getting these investments, but they could pay off big time, and we could have some amazing innovation centers. So this quote is really pointing to the government positioned as a venture capitalist, as an institution which is willing to take on risk that the private sector doesn't want to, which also frames these regions as risky places. But they have potential to deliver for national competitiveness, which of course the US was and remains very concerned about. Next, I'll do the second quote. So these places are ready to be activated. The federal government is saying, yeah, I believe in these places and we're going to do more. So here, this research participant is kind of calling on this latency theme. These places are waiting and ready to be activated. They're inactive somehow right now. And again, positions the government as a venture capitalist that believes in and is ready to deliver investment there. Just for the sake of time, I won't go through the first quote, but it calls on kind of rebalancing the spatial unevenness of growth centers across the US. A few more quotes that get to a couple other themes. I'll start with the first one. You can't overestimate the effects of deindustrialization. These places have failed to transition to a services economy. They've been left behind by an information-based economy. So this quote points to how these places are framed as being left behind by the market, by globalized markets, and by structural transitions in the last in the last few decades. But that new path development could be possible there. Next, I'll do the second quote, which is, "It's to the benefit of the whole country to take advantage of the qualities and potential in these places. These places are underutilized right now." So again, pointing to this latent potential and their potential to contribute to the full national economy, not only to be kind of self-sustaining or have growth trajectories on their own terms. And that this last quote also kind of points to those themes to contribute to national growth. And these kind of narratives around latent potential also show up in how policy is constructed. So just a couple quotes from place-based policy programs, which were authorized during the Biden administration. First, the Tech Hubs program, regions with the assets, resources, and capacity to transform into globally competitive centers, catalyzing new jobs. And then the second one, the establishment of new regional innovation ecosystems in regions that have not fully participated in the technology boom of the last few decades. So both of these quotes, again, call on regions that are ready to receive this investment and transition in a catalytic way. I'll also note that this idea of readiness is a major theme, readiness being kind of associated with, I think this quote says it well, the assets, resources, and capacity. So these are places that already have, so to speak, the infrastructure assets in place. They just need the state to come in as a venture capitalist, and then they can grow and flourish. Okay, the picture is a little bit different for foreclosed potential regions. So whereas latent potential regions are narrated in an asset frame, there is another spatial imaginary around left behind places, which operates in a deficit frame. And I'm calling those foreclosed potential regions because it's though their potential to grow is precluded and is closed off from them based on their histories and current statuses. So just to offer comparison, but direct comparison in this table. So the narrated economic geography in foreclosed potential regions is that they are locked in to declining or low growth paths, and new path development is not yet possible here. And there's a need for infrastructural baselines to be met. So there in this frame, instead of being left behind by globalized markets or by structural changes in the market, these places have been left behind by the federal state. Because in this narrative, there's policy experts describe a racialized history of historical disadvantage and underinvestment by the federal government, by the federal state itself. This is one place where U.S. policy narratives, I think, are distinct from European narratives. Whereas it really is framed around the state leaving these places behind. So that positions the state and foreclosed potential regions' relationship to the state, where the state is a welfare provider and it's providing assistance or support on moral grounds. I think this distinction here, where policy is imagined to be investment in the latent regions versus policy is imagined as being assistance or support, is very key distinction in the narratives and implications for those narratives in these two types of imagined places. So the policy problems which are assigned to these types of places is that there's a need for modernization of infrastructure versus modernization of industry. There's a need to build capacity. There's a lot of discussion around these regions as being low capacity. So that implies administrative and technical knowledge as well as just labor capacity, which translates into a lack of readiness. So there's kind of a narrative around how these places aren't yet ready to receive federal investment because they don't have they don't have assets. So again, it's kind of framed around their deficits. They're not ready for it yet. So we just need to get their basic infrastructure in place. So successful policy for foreclosed regions would look like rebalancing national standards of living versus rebalancing the spatial innovation economy, and achieving the structural and capacity baselines in order to be ready to start to grow. Because right now they're not ready. They're not ready. Or so it is narrated that way. Okay, a few quotes to illustrate these themes. I'll start in the middle. So there are places that are truly left behind. They need help, not because they're going to help the national US economy be more competitive. As a country, we just need to help these places because of industry or because of, excuse me, history and its inner values to do so. It's kind of like place-based policy is social policy instead of economic policy. So here, this quote is demonstrating this kind of morality behind delivering assistance. Their use of the word help implies assistance and support versus a policy which is expected to deliver a return on investment. So it's not about economic returns here. The top quote also kind of harkens on this theme where they're saying we need to support these regions and it's not about economic efficiency. The federal government delivers subsidies to these places. So again, this is, yeah, kind of releasing or indicates that the government is not expecting an economic return on investment. Actually, they accept that it's inefficient to deliver dollars to these places, and therefore it's framed as assistance or support. And then this final quote, these communities have had their futures severed by historical disadvantage and outright discrimination. And again, kind of these structural transitions. So this indicates how the historical advantage, or excuse me, historical disadvantages in foreclosed potential regions is associated with racialized histories of historical disadvantage, which again are very real and can be mapped. But I think it's interesting and important that the racialized history enters the foreclosed potential regions frame, but it doesn't show up in the latent potential regions frame. So I think that racialized boundary is important. Okay, a couple more quotes. Again, kind of not expecting the first one, these investments are very risky. They might not pay off, acknowledging kind of inefficiencies. The second quote here, policies constructed to deliver assistance. They deliver support, but people stay poor. And it's like, oh, we'll just clean up the mess. Let's not include them in the future, forward-looking innovation policies. So I think that this kind of, I'm playing with this idea, but there's some emerging work on the temporal dimension of spatial imaginaries, almost as spatio-temporal imaginaries. And I think the latent potential regions are kind of framed around their future potential, while the foreclosed potential regions are framed around their historical or past disadvantage. Let's see. Yeah, and then this last quote kind of points toward the lack of readiness, lack of capacity. Capacity is a really big theme that comes up. Yeah, so they can become ready to receive investments down the line. So they're not ready yet, but maybe they'll be ready in the future. Again, this shows up in the way policy is constructed. So these are examples from two different programs, which have more of a social equity type motivation than a growth motivation as the programs which are kind of designed to access the latent potential regions. So the Recompete program will invest in economically distressed communities that have for too long been forgotten. And then in the second program, from its kind of mission statement, it's meant to invest in places with impediments to fully participating in access of daily life. So this kind of points toward not only the economic motives for policy targeting these types of regions, but also the social kind of moral imperatives. Okay, now that I've described my findings, thank you for staying with me in the last few minutes. I'd like to, kind of review these findings, how we are thinking about them now, and then open up for some discussion about the implications of the narratives we assign to Left Behind Places and the narratives framing regional inequality debates today. So in summary, I've identified two different narrative frames within the Left Behind Places spatial imaginary, and they each carry a distinct set of policy problems, which has implications for how place-based policies are designed, and what types of regions have access to different federal, central, state programs. Latent potentials, latent potential regions are framed around their assets and their comparative and competitive potential competitive advantages, which emerge from their comparative advantages, which make them an investment opportunity. Foreclosed potential regions are framed around their deficits and a failure of the US state to correct for market equilibriums and for regional inequalities in the long run. But I think it's important to observe that both of these frames are really, even though latent potential regions are framed around their assets, both of these narrative frames kind of stem from a deficit frame, like in the macro, and from capital's perspective on spatially uneven development. So they both frame Left Behind Places generally as places where capital is scarce, and they're framed reductively around their economic potential. This forecloses kind of the full diversity of social, economic, ecological relations and possibilities which might exist which do exist in such places, by only kind of narrating them and framing them around their economic potential, or the scarcity of capital that exists there relative to other places. So I think at the beginning I described how there's been calls in scholarship to take on a more relational perspective in how regional inequalities, spatial inequalities are produced. I think taking on that relational perspective really requires kind of an abundance frame. Rather than viewing the kind of persistent poverty or deprived regions only through the lens of capital, we might reimagine regions for the full diversity and abundance of relations that they provide. Before I leave you with a closing question, I just want to kind of wrap up by acknowledging that because foreclosed potential regions are narrated so closely with racialized histories of dispossession, which are, again, very true in the US, this draws a racialized boundary around who and where are considered to be productive potential contributors to the US economy. And basically, we're saying that Black communities, tribal communities, especially, require assistance rather than investment. So that's obviously somewhat problematic, and something which we need to be, take a closer look at. So, okay. So I'd like to kind of leave us all with this question before we open it up for discussion. What would reimagining Left Behind Places in an abundance frame look like versus through only a deficit frame? And I think that this is where we as young and emerging scholars should be thinking about taking the next turn in regional inequality debates, is how do we participate in these discourses, produce knowledge about regional inequality without kind of reinforcing these reductive narratives, which kind of could have a hand in reproducing development traps for them. So my answer is that, kind of what I was saying a moment ago. I mean, first we might think about dropping the Left Behind Places term, which belongs to global capital. And I think there's a broad recognition that it's pejorative and reductive at the same time. But I think to really take on a more abundance frame might entail reimagining peripheralized spaces in a way that problematizes and recognizes the complexity of social, economic, environmental and political relations that they hold, both within marginalized communities and the relations which produce spatial marginalization. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. And with that, I will conclude and just say thank you again to the organizers for hosting me and to everyone for participating today and joining in. I'm so excited to hear from you all. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, many thanks, Greta, for the inspiring talk, particularly since it's super early in Wyoming right now. And you've been with us for the last 45 minutes already that early in the morning. I'm really looking forward to work more on the topic and discuss more. But with like 30 people participating, I would open the floor. So everyone who has like a question, please raise your hand and then unmute yourself and speak. And just to give you a bit of time, I would start with the initial question. If you could already observe something like a shift in these imaginaries and between these latent potential regions and foreclosed potential places due to the political shift with the government which is now in charge and probably not seeing these investment opportunities in regional resources and regional assets in the area of like green transitions, like the previous government. But now with like the current government, also these regional assets are different ones, probably the ones from beforehand. And if you could already observe something like a shift in these policy discourses, regarding left-behind places.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Max. That's a big question. I want to caveat my answer by saying would be very anecdotal. I haven't collected any data in the Trump administration. Um, but maybe, a couple anecdotal observations. I think there's definitely a shift. I think I think in the Biden administration and the folks who I was talking to who were generally, not entirely, but generally aligned with the Biden administration's ideologies, and had a hand in producing the ideas that showed up in their policy agendas. I think there was that frame around the correcting for historical disadvantage was a major motivator, and framing these places as or foreclosed places as being left behind by the state, and recognizing systemic histories of state disinvestment, uneven investment across communities and regions. I think that is a frame, and then kind of the moral imperative to reinvest and correct that, and almost a restorative justice kind of mindset. I think that is a narrative aspect which has likely been lost in the transition to the new administration. However, the Trump administration has not entirely rolled back. Well, I'll say this. Some of the major policy bill vehicles that delivered Biden administration place-based policy were really bipartisan. The CHIPS and Science Act was sponsored by the Montana Republican senator where I was living at the time. As was the infrastructure investment in our big infrastructure bill. So kind of like, and even the green transition incentives were all really oriented toward the private market, and kind of incentivizing green technologies investment and innovation. So I think like some of those major policy vehicles were in practice much more bipartisan than the political rhetoric might kind of lead one to believe. So for that reason, a number of those policies are still here and don't appear to be getting rolled back anytime soon. And actually, Trump is like taking credit for some of them. Like, oh my God, look, the U.S. is getting this huge investment in chips production from Intel because of Biden era place-based industrial policies. So I think that's like one thing to note. And then maybe regarding kind of the latent potential regions, I mean, I think, I don't know, the Trump frame, certainly in like traditional manufacturing places and the way that he's delivering policy through tariffs has maybe less of a direct place-based policy intervention, but nonetheless has kind of a place-based imaginary around, the steel worker, the manufacturing blue collar worker whose job was taken away. So maybe it's a bit more job creation focused than necessarily like national competitiveness focused. I don't know.
Yeah, many thanks. Anyone from the audience? I don't know. I haven't checked the chat yet. Andrea, please.
Yes, I hope that you can hear me. Yes,
Yes.
okay. So thank you, Grete, and for the presentation, and thank you to the organizers. Of course, it was very interesting to hear about something across the ocean that is nonetheless so relevant and so close to my, at least, environment here in Italy. I completely agree on the issue of the spatial imaginaries and the narratives, and it's very interesting to see how they're constructed and reconstructed and negotiated upon. It's interesting to see that you perceived it, I guess, or you portrayed it as a moral imperative, because at least here in Italy, for example, more than a moral imperative, there is some kind of I would say, spatial justice imperative in terms of equalization of citizenship rights. We could also say maybe opportunities, and I'm thinking about maybe like something related to the capabilities approach. I had a question related to your fieldwork mostly. So I was wondering if you recognize any patterns in terms of similarities and differences on how the different actors and the different interviewees constructed these narratives across governance levels. So I was wondering if talking with someone at a higher governance level or with even just different responsibilities and function, maybe thematic to infrastructures or jobs, portrayed a different narrative. So I was assuming that maybe at a lower scale, spatial scale, anger takes upon the moral justification, and maybe at a higher governance level, the assistentialism comes forward. So I was wondering if you noticed this difference, um, and also if besides the policy intervention that I think you are describing, which is mostly top down, I was wondering if you, in these areas that you researched, that you conducted your fieldwork, if you noticed any initiatives that don't necessarily require state intervention, so community-based initiatives, or maybe remunicipalization of services and that kind of stuff, of welfare, basically. And how does that maybe create a counter narrative? Thanks.
Andrea, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for these questions and comments to just kind of feedback. Overall, I'll just say I feel like you're just spot on like the cutting edge of my thinking and the next things which come from this, but that also means that I don't have answers for you yet. So, but just a few things come to mind. I think regarding the moral imperative and spatial justice, I'm really interested in this and especially potential for comparison. You mentioned the word citizenship, and I think that that could be a really big theme to examine, especially like the comparative politics of citizenship, because well, first, I've done a bit of reading on it, only enough to know that it's a whole large literature that will require more. But one of the themes that comes up in citizenship, kind of like critical perspectives on citizenship, um, is, well, first of all, is kind of like different vantage points. So, like how the state sees citizenship versus how citizens see themselves, what that implies, what a good citizen means, etc. But I think the left behind places and regarding kind of the moral imperative in different societies to achieve or deliver spatial justice, there's a real question at the heart of, I think, today's regional inequality debates, which I didn't talk about this at the beginning, which are also framed, of course, across the global north by neoliberal, like walking back of governance services and rationalizations over the last several decades. So as you know, the state has walked back that, you know, infrastructure and critical services investment. We have, yeah, essentially like a question of to what extent are states delivering on their like delivering services for their citizens kind of within like a social contract of a citizen pays taxes and then gets a certain set of essential services and benefits in return. Obviously, the weight of those services and taxes are different across different places, and in the US, it's, you know, pretty thin in that, you know, we have privatized healthcare, et cetera. But I'm interested in how, yeah, kind of states are delivering or not for their citizens at and kind of producing the margins at their territory, which then I think speaks to your last point, which is in places perhaps, and at least in the US, I think this is happening, in places where the state has retreated and is no longer delivering the same level of essential services and infrastructures as they are in other places. In these peripheralized margins, how are kind of, yeah, extra state initiatives emerging to fill the gaps left behind by the state? Is that taking place in the nonprofit sector through kind of just local grassroots organizing? Like what new institutions are emerging? Kind of almost in like an anarchical question, although you know, but I wonder the politics of it. And I'm developing a new case study where I'm exploring just this, how, yeah, in a deprived rural region of Wyoming, kind of how are people filling the gaps to get their social welfare and essential service needs met, is a big question that I have right now. And then I just responded to your comments. I didn't answer your question, which is that across different scales of government, this interview set was focused on the federal level. I collected interviews at the local level, which were uh, also for my dissertation research, but they were asking a different set of research questions, which make them not easily comparable. However, just this summer, I was working with a grad student who is collecting interviews at the local level across Wyoming to kind of start to draw this comparison of how our regions, which are so-called left behind, or at least they would be called that from the top-down perspective, how do they see their problems? Is policy responding to their problems? And I think there could be some, we haven't gotten into analysis yet, but I think there could be some opportunity to compare the narrative frames as well. So yeah, thanks for asking those questions, which are right in line with my thinking.
Any further questions? We are also getting closer to 4 p.m. But any last remarks, questions, comments? Please feel free and don't feel shy. Otherwise, Many thanks again, Grete. And yeah, with that, we also want to invite all of you to the 15th of October webinar on electoral outcomes as a form of discontent with Arndt Leininger, a political scientist from the Chemnitz University of Technology. And yeah, thanks again to all of you for participating. Many thanks again, Grete. And yeah, we hope to see you next month and wish you a pleasant day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.